Welcome to the end of chapter 52. In this section, instead of talking about terrestrial biomes and ecosystems, we're going to just do a quick overview of aquatic ones, and then the rest of the chapter goes into kind of fundamental ecological interactions, how basically all things are connected. Now, kind of like the last lecture where we looked at different terrestrial biomes like deserts versus forests, this one we're going to look at kind of different aquatic kind of biomes, different aquatic settings. Some of them I will describe to you with a little detail, and some of them you can just read on your own. It's not that there's nothing special about them, but I don't feel the need to go into much depth. Okay, so with aquatic biomes, what you find is that a lot of chemical factors influence that environment much more so than, say, terrestrial environments. So the kind of rocks or type of soil that's in the region can have a big effect on the lakes, streams, and rivers. And probably the most obvious difference that we see in aquatic ecosystems is a salty marine system versus what we call freshwater systems. Those two are going to be very different, and that's just simply a chemical concentration factor that goes into that. You might not realize this, but we actually divide bodies of water, and from an ecological perspective, into many different zones. So I want to talk to you about these zones real quick. Here we have a freshwater lake versus kind of an oceanic system, a marine system. There are a lot of different terms here. I don't know how they would come up on an AP exam. I don't know if they would come up at all. But I want to point out just a few general concepts that you may not realize. And there's a lot of similar terminology that you see in both of these. So if the water is deep enough, you actually have a limit to how much light can penetrate deep into the water. So this is what we call the photic zone. The photic zone, which exists in both freshwater and marine systems, marine meaning saltwater basically, is the region where you have light penetrating to a certain depth. So photosynthesis can occur there, and things that use vision, predominantly their vision, can function there very well. And then you have the aphotic zone, being a prefix meaning without or not, where you do not have as much light, or in some cases in deep oceans, any light at all that penetrates that deep. So in the really deep parts of the ocean where there is no light whatsoever, that's where you find some of the really unusual fish that will kind of bioluminesce. They will create their own light through biological processes using different enzymes. So you have kind of a light is available, light is not available breakdown in freshwater and in marine. And then the other term that I would be familiar with is this term benthic. Benthic, and I've never heard this term outside of aquatic ecosystems, but maybe it's a general vocabulary term you could fit into your language somehow, and I'm not sure what it means, but it is the bottom. It is the ground at the bottom of either the lake or what we would call the ocean floor. And in benthic zones, because there's actual ground there, you can find a very different set of organisms. And deep enough in oceans, or even if it's a very deep lake, pressure can become a factor that the living things have to deal with. In fact, there are some marine organisms that live under such deep pressure that they actually have a different ratio of saturated to unsaturated fats. They have more unsaturated fats in their body because the pressure will pack those loose unsaturated fats into solid. And if you bring them up, some of these organisms, some of these fish will basically just melt at normal pressures because they just turn into the oil that the unsaturated fats that make up their body are. Do you remember why unsaturated fats are more liquidy?
Less hydrogen.
I really like the guess. And you're right. There are less hydrogen atoms because there's more what kind of bonds?
Covalent.
What kind of covalent bonds?
Hydrogen bonds.
No, hydrogen bonds aren't covalent bonds.
We're all getting fives.
Yeah, I'm 100. LOL. Double bonds. Remember, saturated fats are all single bonds, so the fatty tails are straight. But when you throw in double bonds, what happens? They bend and get kinked a little bit. So, yeah, a lot of deep water organisms will have more of those kinked, unsaturated tails. And it's a looser fat, but under the pressure, it becomes more solid. So that's kind of an evolutionary advantage to have more unsaturated fats in your body composition. But that's really, really deep water. Okay, so a few things, some pretty important ecological processes that occur that you may not even be aware of. In lakes, and the lake has to be fairly deep, but you can probably get this at 5 feet of depth. It doesn't take a very deep body of water for this to happen. In winter and summer, if you have a kind of pronounced 4 seasons in the region, you can get what's called a thermocline, or temperature stratification. So you can find layers of water in lakes that are different temperatures. And if any of you have ever gone to like a big lake and swam and you dive down a little bit, like in the middle of the summer, what do you find?
It's cooler.
Yeah, you can feel like the colder water, and it exists as, I mean, not a perfectly like straight line boundary, but it exists in different layers. And in the summer, it's going to be warmer water at the top, the cooler water at the bottom. In the winter, the warmer water typically is at the bottom and the colder water is at the top. So, the top obviously is being more influenced by whatever the air temperature is. But if you notice, if you have this stratification one season and this stratification the next, the warm layer at the bottom one season will become the top layer. So in spring and autumn, lakes will actually turn over. We call it turnover because they turn over, where they mix. And this is very important in lake systems. You get a lot of nutrients that are at the bottom or top of a lake that get mixed around so that they're available to other types of living things. There are organisms that will live closer to the surface or on the benthic zone at the bottom of the lake. And so this cycling based on temperature stratification is actually a really, if you have people that study lakes or experts in like lake ecology and biology, this is a very important process. Now, here's a weird story for you. And this is something that turnover is very important for, but also that can sometimes be disastrous. at the bottom of a lake, you find all the dying, dead material that sinks to the bottom, and bacteria work on all the dead material at the bottom of the lake. And as they're working to eat all of that material and break it down, they're using up oxygen. So you can get a situation where there is very little oxygen at the bottom, and actually a buildup of things like carbon dioxide. And some of the bacteria in the terrestrial, or the ground, the bed, actually in the soil here, you can get a buildup of different like sulfur gases. I don't know if you've ever like walked in a lake or at the edge of a lake. Some lakes, especially if you have a lot of leaf matter, like a big thick layer of leaf matter, you step on it, bubbles come up, and it smells kind of like rotten eggs. That's from sulfur gases. So you can get a buildup of all sorts of gases and a lack of oxygen. Well, there was a very deep, or is a very deep lake, I can't remember where in Africa this is, but a large deep lake, and there was a village next to this lake, and I think this was in the 1960s or 70s. It experienced a turnover event, and it released all of this carbon dioxide and sulfur gases in one big kind of immediate turnover event, and it suffocated everyone in the village. I mean, it was just, so I remember there was a story of like a family that came back to the village that were gone during this time, and everybody was just dead. And it was from a turnover event from a very deep, large lake that actually changed the atmosphere around the lake. But turnover is important. There are two terms, I would say, of all the terms I tell you about today that I would want you to focus on the most and remember, and that's these two terms, oligotrophic and eutrophic. These are two really, really important aquatic ecosystem terms. Now, I'm going to give you as simple of a definition as I can. Basically, oligotrophic means low nutrient. Low nutrients. Eutrophic is high nutrients. And you probably in your mind are thinking like, oh, I see why that would be important, whether there's not much, nutrition out there for the life, or there's a lot of nutrition out there for life. But it might work a little different from how you think. In oligotrophic lakes, and these are typically seen like alpine lakes, like have you ever been to Lake Tahoe out in Nevada? Anybody ever been out there? This is a high elevation lake. There is not much runoff into this lake. The lake is basically filled with snow melt, which is a pretty pure form of water that doesn't carry a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus with it. And as a result, there aren't a lot of sources of key elements like nitrogen and phosphorus. So there's not much algae growth as a result, and the water is very clear. It's so clear, like, and this is not Lake Tahoe, but in Lake Tahoe, it's so clear you can see like leaves sitting on the bottom of the lake, and it'll be like 8 or 10 feet down. Now, if you go to Lake Lanier or any other eutrophic lake, these lakes have a lot of input of nitrogen and phosphorus from rotting leaf material, soil runoff, and a lot of times when people live around these lakes, it's like sewage input. And when you have a situation like that, you get a lot of algae and plant growth. The water is not clear at all. And it can actually cause some problems because if you have too much growth, there's too much demand on the oxygen that's dissolved in the water, and you can actually get like fish kills from a lack of oxygen. And those fish die and rot, and more oxygen is used up. The lake on campus here is what?
Huge.
It is eutrophic. There is all sorts of runoff from the mountain. There's all sorts of fertilizer input put onto campus that ends up in that lake. And as a result, it has a lot of stuff growing in it, and you cannot see 8 to 10 feet down to the bottom of the lake at the deep parts, or at any part really in that lake. So low nutrient lakes are actually the ones you would look at and be like, wow, how pretty and clean. Even though you might think low nutrient is bad, it's actually can prevent a lot of like kind of a explosion of algae growth. Okay, the book goes through, discusses wetlands and some important parts about them, streams and rivers and how they're different from lakes. I did want to mention that estuaries are where rivers do what?
They mix with salt water.
That's right. It's where rivers end up meeting the ocean, and because of tides, you get kind of these fluxes of fresh and salt water mixing together, and this is where you get kind of like brackish water, if you've ever heard of that. If anyone is into keeping aquaria, you have brackish fish. These are unique regions of the world. What's that?
The Humboldt Beach House.
Yeah.
It's really cool. Like
Yes, they definitely attract very unique life forms.
No, my dad's like obsessed with it. She just like
This is referred to as the oceanic pelagic zone. Pelagic kind of refers to open waters away from the coast. So if you go like deep sea fishing, you're out near the pelagic zone if you go out far enough. You actually have to get pretty far away from the coast before you're in like kind of open pelagic waters. It has its own kind of unique set of circumstances. And then you've probably heard of coral reefs. They are one of the most diverse kind of ecological systems in the world, with a lot of different aquatic interactions. And then we go to this benthic zone. This is where you can get some really unusual life forms. I would say if you're ever curious about kind of the weirdest living things on Earth, go to the bottom of like deep oceans. You can have these completely dark regions that are kind of based on like sulfur metabolism. There are strange events and types of living things that exist in a lot of these regions where like when a whale dies and sinks to the bottom, there are organisms that basically just, hop from whale carcass to whale carcass. And that's their life. And that's how their ecology works. These benthic, deep sea benthic regions are pretty unusual. So I would just go through and become somewhat familiar with some of the fundamentals of each of these systems. And then just the last few things in this chapter. Section 4 talks about essentially how you have dispersal. Like, why are there kangaroos in Australia and not elsewhere? And why are they in certain parts of Australia? And a lot of it has to do with where their ancient ancestors came from and ended up. In the case of kangaroos, they give this example. Their ancestors ended up in this region that, due to plate tectonics, broke away from the rest of the world. They became isolated there. And even within Australia, based on precipitation, temperature, and biomes on that landmass, you have habitats that are good for some species of kangaroo versus others.
Just for clarification, there are 6 departments. Each department set of questions is one.
Okay, and I just hand this to a prefect.
You'll hand it to the team at 9:15.
Okay, and I have my Google Meet.
The prefect should open up.
The prefects have
and your virtual learner should.
Okay,
I'll send
but they
them
take care of all that.
Yes.
Okay, I'll just
They
monitor.
need to let you know who the virtual learners are.
All right, thank you.
Hey, sorry to interrupt.
No problem. Sorry for the interruption. So you'll look at some examples of dispersion or dispersal. It's obviously where you find certain organisms is based on the biome, which is based on the climate, which is influenced by temperature and precipitation or water availability. It's also limited to the ability for that organism to move away from its, point of birth. So they give the example of this saguaro cactus in the southwest U.S. and in Mexico. Here we have a desert biome, and the green dots represent the distribution of this cactus population. And the reason you would find the cactus here, in this region instead of, say, here in Rome, Georgia, is because it's limited by its biome that has a boundary. It's not capable of getting its seeds very far, and outside of its biome, it can't compete. And I know some of this might seem a little bit simple, like, well, you find cactuses in deserts. Well, they go into a little bit of the details as to why and examples of how certain factors influence dispersal of an organism around the world. And then finally, the chapter ends with kind of the key point of ecology, which is that all life really influences all other life. This is an enormous interconnected web. The animals that show up and thrive in a region are often there because of the types of plants you have in that region. But the animals affect the plants that grow in a region just as much as the plants affect the animals. So plants benefit from the bees or butterflies or hummingbirds that can pollinate their flowers. The bees, the butterflies, the hummingbirds benefit from those specific plants. And if you change one part of that, the whole system becomes affected. So they kind of go into some examples of that at the end of chapter 52, and that's where we're going to stop today. You have the rest of this class to work on your video project. Next class, we'll start chapter 53, and you'll have a little bit more time to work on your video project. And I'll see you later. Bye. Bye.